She was beaten for birthing a girl. The widowed sheriff took both mother and baby in. Dry Hollow, Wyoming. Winter, 1879. The snow fell in thin, scattered whispers, covering the dirt paths of Dry Hollow in a ghostly film. The town had long since gone quiet. Oil lamps flickered behind curtained windows. Only the old church at the end of the main street stood with a faint golden glow in its steeple. Delilah Carter stumbled through the drifting snow, her breath catching like broken glass in her throat. Blood darkened the edges of her torn dress and soaked through the worn linen swaddle wrapped around the newborn cradled tightly to her chest. The infant did not cry, only whimpered, as if the cold and fear were already too much. The scent of sweat, blood, and stale tobacco clung to Delilah's hair. Her steps faltered as she reached the steps of the church. She sank to her knees and leaned against the wooden door. Her knuckles rapped once, twice. "Please," she whispered. "Please, help us." A faint rustle came from inside. The door creaked open just a sliver, revealing the lined face of the town's pastor. He looked at her. Then the blood. Then the child. "We cannot take sides in a couple's business," he murmured, and the door closed again with a click. Delilah didn't scream. She didn't beg again. Her arms curled tighter around the baby. "Please," she said one more time. But this time it was just to the sky. "She's the only one I have left. 6 years ago, she was sold at 16. Her father called it a blessing, married off to Jed Carter, a man twice her age, a hunter with mean eyes and a thirst for a son. Her first birth came at 18, a girl. Jed vanished for 3 days without a word. The second birth, another girl. Jed smashed a chair against the wall, called her cursed, told her God was laughing at him. The third time, at 21, she didn't even get to meet the child. Jed beat her bloody before she could finish the sentence. I think it's another girl. The miscarriage came that night, silent and final. 3 daughters, all gone, none buried with names. Jed didn't stop trying, didn't stop hitting. And now, this fourth one, born under the roof of rage and expectation. It's a girl, Delilah had whispered through tears after the birth. Jed's face twisted in fury. I should have known, he roared. All you birth is worthless mouths. He hit her, first her shoulder, then her back. She clutched the baby, shielding it with her body. His fists came down again. And again. She fled, barefoot in the cold, no plan, only instinct. A crunch of boots broke the stillness. Sheriff Thomas Graves stood in the snow, hat low, greatcoat dusted white. He had been walking back from the saloon, where silence suited him better than company. His face was drawn, haunted by loss. 4 years had passed since the fire took his wife and son, but the embers still lived behind his eyes. He saw her on the steps, a woman, soaked in blood, holding something small. He stepped forward slowly. Delilah lifted her head, lips cracked, eyes wide with fear. He hit me, she said, voice rasping, because she's a girl. Thomas looked down at the infant in her arms. His jaw clenched. Then he removed his coat and knelt. You don't have to say more, he said quietly. Let me carry you both. Delilah froze. For a second, she looked ready to run again. But then she nodded. Once. Thomas wrapped the coat around her and lifted her gently, one arm under her legs, the other steadying her back. The baby was between them, tiny and quiet. The church doors remained shut, the street empty. And as the snow kept falling, Thomas turned away and walked toward the only place he hadn't dared enter for 4 years, his home. The snow still whispered against the windows, as Thomas Graves pushed open the front door to a house he had not set foot in for more than a night's sleep in years. But this time, he did not come home alone. Delilah leaned heavily in his arms, nearly unconscious. The baby nestled against her chest let out a weak sigh. Thomas crossed the threshold with both and paused just beyond the entry, as though afraid the silence inside might swallow them whole. He did not turn toward the town doctor's cabin, though it was closer, better lit, easier. He knew how this town worked. If he brought her to the clinic, news would spread within the hour. Men with guns and names would come knocking. They would call it domestic matters. They would send her back. So instead, he brought her here. On the ride over, she'd spoken only once, her voice weak and breaking. "Please don't take me back," she'd said. Again and again, like it was the only thread holding her upright. "I will not," Thomas had answered, low but certain. Inside, the air smelled faintly of ash and something older, dust and memory. The hearth was cold. The table still bore the same oil ring left by his wife's favorite mug. Nothing had moved in 4 years, except the dust. He stepped through the main room and hesitated at the hallway. A door at the end waited, closed, untouched. He opened it with one boot and entered the room that had once held everything warm in his life. The bed was still made, the same quilt, faded but folded tight. There was a softness here, a sorrow too thick to name. Thomas laid Delilah gently down. Her eyes fluttered open, panic snapping through her like a whip. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her body coiling. "You need a bed," Thomas said. "I'll sleep outside." He took 2 steps back and nodded toward the baby. "She needs you whole." Delilah blinked, stunned, her breath stuttering. She looked around the room like it might bite her, but then she sank into the pillow, the fight draining from her. Thomas stepped out. He grabbed the kettle from the stove and filled it from the well behind the house. He boiled the water in silence and soaked a cloth, wrung it out, and set it beside her hand, close but not touching. Then he placed a small tin plate with bread and cold beans on the bedside table. "If the baby cries," he murmured from the doorway, "wake me." He left the door ajar and walked back to the front room. Delilah did not sleep. She lay curled around the infant, one hand on the tiny back, feeling every rise and fall. Her body ached in places she didn't recognize. Her eyes burned, but she did not cry. She could not. Every creak of the floor, every groan of wind outside made her flinch. But the house remained quiet. Thomas sat with his back against the front door, rifle across his lap. He stared at nothing, eyes glassy. He had not taken off his boots. He did not move to light the fire in the hearth. Instead, he watched the shadows, the edges, the corners of memory. In that silence, 2 people breathed. 2 broken pieces, still bleeding from different wounds. But for one night, just one, they shared a roof that did not judge, and a stillness that did not demand answers. The baby stirred restlessly in Delilah's arms, her tiny fists curling and uncurling with a weak, jittery rhythm. The color in her cheeks had faded, replaced with a pale hue that chilled Delilah deeper than the night air ever could. She rocked her slowly, whispering soft nothings, the same way she'd once whispered to the 3 children who had never made it past their first weeks. The weight of those memories pressed against her like an unseen boulder, making every breath feel borrowed. "I'll name you Hope," she said aloud, though her voice barely reached beyond the baby's ear. "Because you have to live. You have to." Her hands trembled as she wiped the sweat from the infant's brow. The child's skin burned beneath her fingertips. "No," Delilah whispered, shaking her head. "Not you. Not again." She bundled the baby tighter and stood on unsteady legs, panic clawing its way up her throat. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She stumbled out of the bedroom and across the cold wood floor, swinging the door open. "Sheriff," she called out into the darkness. "Please, please help her." Thomas appeared within seconds, his boots heavy, eyes alert. Delilah pressed the bundle into his arms without thinking, her breath fractured and frantic. She's burning up. I do not know what to do, please." Her voice cracked as her body shook. Thomas didn't speak. He only cradled the infant, as if she were the most fragile thing he had ever touched. His rough hands, calloused from years of labor and loss, moved with a gentleness Delilah had never seen in a man. He knelt near the hearth, stoked the embers until the flames licked high, then settled Hope in a nest of blankets near the warmth. He soaked a cloth in warm water and gently placed it on her forehead, his touch precise and reverent. Delilah sank to her knees beside him, watching as he moved with quiet purpose. Her chest clenched with emotion she couldn't name, a deep, aching crack forming somewhere inside the wall she'd built around her heart. "No man ever touched my child gently," she murmured, voice barely audible. Thomas looked at her briefly, but said nothing. He only reached for a nearby wooden box on a shelf, opened it, and revealed a collection of small glass vials and folded linens, old remedies, kept clean and dry for years. The lid of the box bore a name burned into the grain: Mary Graves. He pulled out a small knife from his belt and, without a word, added a single name to the edge of the lid in careful, slow strokes: Hope. Delilah covered her mouth with her hand, tears pricking the corners of her eyes, not from fear or pain or shame, but something far more disarming. Hope let out a soft sigh, and her small fingers unclenched. Her breathing evened, ever so slightly. Delilah exhaled shakily, pressing a kiss to the baby's damp forehead. The fever was still there, but it no longer felt like a death sentence. "She will live," Thomas said quietly, more a promise than a statement. Delilah turned toward him, her eyes wide, vulnerable, not afraid, not questioning, just seeing him. She had seen many faces, angry, drunken, dismissive, indifferent. But in this man's silence, she saw something new, something she had never been given: care without condition, presence without demand. She did not speak. Words would have broken the spell. Instead, she nodded, and in that nod was something fragile but true: trust. Not in the town, not in the law, not even in herself just yet, but in him. And in that moment, as the fire warmed the baby's feet and the snow thickened outside, 3 broken hearts beat a little stronger under one roof. Delilah swept the ashes in slow, deliberate motions. Her movements were quiet, almost reverent. Dust swirled in the sunlight that pierced through the warped windowpanes, making the whole room glow in a soft, golden haze. The parlor had not been touched in years, not truly. Cobwebs clung to corners. The fireplace was layered in soot. The shelves carried stillness more than books. She moved toward the mantel, where a faded photograph sat tilted, and next to it a glass vial of dried lavender, long dead but still faintly fragrant. Her hand hovered above it, unsure. Then she saw the scarf, pale ivory, delicate, the kind a woman might have worn to church. She reached out and lifted it gently. Behind her, Thomas's footsteps stopped. Delilah turned quickly, lowering the scarf like a child caught reaching into a forbidden drawer. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to touch her things." Thomas looked at the scarf in her hands. For a long second, he said nothing. Then, in a voice so low it barely reached her, "They're just things. You're alive." The words landed soft, but heavy. Delilah folded the scarf and set it down with care. "Still, I didn't want to be disrespectful." "You weren't," he said, then moved to help her with the ashes. That afternoon, the scent of stew simmering filled the house for the first time in years. Delilah stirred the pot gently, tasting and adjusting, humming under her breath. Thomas sat outside on the porch, whittling a piece of pine in his hands, watching the smoke rise from the chimney like something sacred had been reborn. By the time the sun dipped low, the smell of bread and spice wafted from the kitchen. One by one, curious neighbors passed by, slowing near the window. No one knocked. But they looked. And Delilah saw the way they whispered. "That's the girl beater's wife," someone muttered near the fence. Delilah stiffened by the stove. Thomas stepped down from the porch, his boots hitting dirt with finality. He stood still, looked toward the small crowd that had gathered under pretense of strolling by. "She's under my protection," he said evenly. "Anyone touches her answers to me." His voice carried like the wind, quiet but undeniable. No one replied. They only shuffled off, eyes downcast, leaving behind silence and the scent of stew. Later that evening, Hope gurgled from her place on a folded quilt near the hearth. Delilah knelt beside her, tickling the baby's belly until soft giggles filled the room. Hope's tiny hands reached for the air, her laugh brighter than firelight. Then she looked up at Thomas, who had just stepped inside. Her small mouth opened wide and said, for the first time, "Pa." Thomas froze in place. Delilah covered her mouth in surprise. Then she laughed, a sound that surprised her even more than the baby's word. Thomas crouched slowly, unsure. Hope reached for his bootlaces, smiling. "She thinks you're family," Delilah said softly. Thomas stared at the child. For a brief moment, his face cracked. Something sharp and sorrowful flickered behind his eyes. Grief for the boy he'd once held, for the wife he'd lost, but also warmth. He knelt beside Hope, touched her cheek with one calloused finger. "She laughs like Mary," he murmured. That night, as the fire dimmed and the baby slept, Delilah stood in the doorway to the spare bedroom. She held a folded wool blanket in her arms. A simple thing, stitched unevenly, but warm. "I thought this might keep the draft off," she said, offering it to him. Thomas took the blanket with a nod, brushing her fingers accidentally as he did. Delilah hesitated. "Every home needs softness," she said. He met her gaze for a beat too long. Then his voice low, almost a whisper. "I forgot that." She smiled. It was not wide, not sure, but it was real. And in the flicker of the fire, in the hush of a house that had once held nothing but ghosts, something else stirred, something alive. Delilah didn't belong to anyone, not anymore. But here, in this quiet room, she had started to belong somewhere. The wind carried dust across the yard as the sun hit its peak. Delilah was hanging linen to dry, her hands steady, eyes focused. Hope cooed softly from a basket nearby, chewing the edge of a cloth doll. The quiet cracked like a whip. Hooves thundered in from the east, fast and reckless. A horse reared at the edge of the fence, kicking up dirt and noise. Jed Carter sat slumped in the saddle, half drunk, eyes bloodshot, hair unkempt like he had not slept in days. The scent of whiskey preceded his words. "You stole my wife," he bellowed, pointing a crooked finger toward the house. "And my child." Delilah stepped out from the porch, hands empty. She did not flinch. She did not blink. "I birthed 3 before her," she said, loud enough for the yard to hear. 3 girls, and you beat the life out of each one. You will not touch this one." Jed's laugh was a snarl. "You were mine. You took what was mine." Thomas stepped from around the side of the house, silent as dusk. He stood behind Delilah, one hand resting lightly at his hip, the other hanging loose near his holster. His expression was unreadable, but his presence was like a wall of iron. Jed spit in the dirt. "You think hiding behind a badge makes her yours now?" Thomas did not speak. He did not need to. Jed's eyes flicked to the revolver holstered on the sheriff's hip. For a second, he hesitated. Then he charged. It happened fast. Jed dismounted with a drunken roar, stumbled forward in fury, but Thomas met him halfway. In 2 clean moves, the sheriff sidestepped, twisted Jed's arm behind his back, and slammed him to the ground with practiced ease. Jed cursed, squirmed, but Thomas knelt on him, calm and collected. "You are under arrest," he said, snapping cold iron around Jed's wrists, "on charges of domestic violence, assault, and endangering the welfare of a child. Delilah stood still, her breath caught, as Thomas read the full list of charges aloud with precision. No emotion, just justice. Hope whimpered from the basket. Delilah picked her up, holding her close. Thomas hauled Jed to his feet. "You'll be held until the circuit judge arrives from Cheyenne," he said, leading the struggling man to the wagon at the edge of the road. As word spread through town, whispers buzzed like hornets. "Did you hear? The sheriff's arrested Jed Carter. For hitting his wife? She's pressing charges? Never seen a woman do that before." The jail cell door clanged shut, and Jed slumped to the bench, still shouting about what he was owed. But no one listened. Not anymore. That night, Delilah sat on the porch with Hope asleep in her arms, her eyes fixed on the road Jed had come from. Thomas joined her, settling into the chair beside her without a word. After a long silence, she spoke. "No one ever believed me before." Thomas looked straight ahead. "They will now." She turned to him. "Why?" His voice was quiet. "Because you told the truth. And I was listening." Delilah closed her eyes, holding her daughter a little tighter. For the first time in her life, justice did not feel like a word in a book or a sermon in church. It felt like a man standing behind her, silent, steady, who believed without needing to ask. The wind was bitter that morning. Dry Hollow's courthouse stood like a pale sentinel against the gray sky, its steeple casting a long shadow down Main Street. The benches out front were full. Folks from town who never set foot in church unless someone was marrying or dying now gathered to see a different kind of reckoning. Delilah stepped from the wagon slowly. Hope was with a kind neighbor, swaddled and sleeping. Thomas helped Delilah down, placing his long coat around her shoulders. It swallowed her frame, but she clutched it as if it were armor. "You don't have to do this alone," he said quietly. She looked up at him, breath visible in the cold air. "I know," she said. And then she walked through the courthouse doors. Inside, the wood creaked beneath boots. The room was silent, save for the shuffle of papers and a few quiet coughs. The judge, an old man with a kind mouth but tired eyes, adjusted his glasses as Delilah stepped to the witness stand. Thomas stood behind the railing, arms folded, his badge catching the morning light. "State your name for the record," the judge said. "Delilah Carter," she replied, her voice steady, though her hands trembled beneath the coat. The prosecutor rose. "Mrs. Carter, why are you bringing charges against your husband, Jedediah Carter?" Delilah's eyes did not waver. "Because he beat me." A murmur rippled through the room. The judge raised a hand, and it quieted. "Why did he beat you?" Delilah inhaled once. Then, calmly, she said, "For birthing girls." The silence that followed was sharp enough to draw blood. No one moved, no one breathed. A soft gasp came from the gallery. An older woman near the back covered her mouth, tears welling. Delilah continued, her voice flat, not emotionless, but exhausted. "I was sold to him when I was 16. He wanted a son. I gave him 3 daughters. After the first, he walked out for 3 days. After the second, he smashed the baby's crib and left us without food. After the third, he suspected she was a girl before I even delivered. He beat me until I lost the child." She paused. Her gaze swept the room. "They never had names. He would not let me name them. He said it was a waste." Another rustle. The woman in the back began crying quietly. Delilah took a breath. "My fourth was a girl, too. He hit me again. But this time, I ran. That child, she is the only one still alive." "And your husband?" the prosecutor asked. "He would have buried her, too. If I had stayed, he would have." The judge looked down at his notes. Then at Jed, who sat slouched between 2 deputies, arms crossed, his face twisted with contempt. "You deny these charges, Mr. Carter." Jed's lip curled. She's lying. She ran with my kid. She's soft in the head. The judge turned to the jury. 7 men and 5 women, every face stone still. They returned a verdict in under an hour. Jedediah Carter, the judge declared, you are hereby sentenced to 10 years in the Wyoming Territorial Prison for aggravated assault and battery, and endangering the life of a child. Delilah did not smile. She did not cry. She only nodded once. As the bailiffs dragged Jed away, he cursed, but no one listened. Outside, the crowd dispersed in hushed clusters. Some glanced her way, but no longer with pity or scorn, just quiet acknowledgement. Thomas stood waiting by the wagon. As she reached him, he laid a gentle hand on her shoulder. You did not deserve silence, he said. Delilah looked down at his hand, then up into his eyes. No one ever said that before. He helped her up into the seat, then climbed in beside her. As the wheels rolled away from the courthouse, Delilah rested her hand in her lap. For the first time in her life, she had spoken in front of others and been heard. And for the first time, a man did not silence her. He stood beside her, and the silence was his to hold, not hers to bear. The hammer rang out across the dry land like a heartbeat. Sunlight spilled over the fields of Dry Hollow as Thomas Graves stood on the charred beams of his home's back room, the same room that had once taken his world in fire and smoke. He drove the crowbar into the floorboards, wood blackened by flame, half-eaten by time. The boards groaned and split under the force. One by one, he pulled them free. Delilah stood in the doorway, hope balanced on her hip. She didn't step inside. Her eyes rested on the ashes, the soot-smudged outline where the bed had been, the wall that no longer stood. Thomas looked back at her, sweat darkening his shirt collar. I'm building something for the living now, he said. Delilah said nothing, just held Hope a little closer. For 2 weeks, the sound of hammering and sawing filled the valley. Thomas worked through dusk and dawn. Delilah joined him, at first sweeping up nails and shoveling debris, then helping paint the new window frames, a soft cream color that matched the wildflowers outside. Hope sat under the porch, feet patting the boards, babbling to a worn doll with missing buttons for eyes. It was the first time Thomas had opened those windows in years. When the last brushstroke dried, he stood back and let the sun pour through. The air inside the house no longer smelled of ash, but of new wood, fresh paint, and bread baking. Neighbors began appearing. First, a quiet knock, a basket of biscuits, then jars of milk, a sack of apples, and finally, laughter drifting in through the open window as local women stopped by the porch, asking Delilah if she might teach their daughters how to stitch or calm a colicky baby the way she did. She did not speak much, but what she gave with her hands was enough to be welcomed. One morning, Thomas brought a small cedar box into the kitchen. Delilah sat at the table, Hope chewing on a wooden spoon. The box was freshly sanded, smooth as river stone. He placed it before her, then sat down. I used to keep my son's things in here, he said quietly. After the fire, I packed it away. Delilah ran her fingers along the carved lid. I'm sorry, she whispered. He nodded, then opened the lid. Inside lay a silver rattle, blackened around the edges, and a blue ribbon, faded but intact. Between them, a new engraving had been carved, neat, precise, done by hand. Hope Graves, 1884. Delilah's hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes filled, but no tears fell. She looked at him, not the sheriff, not the man who had saved her, but someone different now, someone building with her. She's yours too? She asked softly. He nodded once. Then, even softer, if you'll have me, this home is for 3 people, not ghosts. Delilah looked toward the window. Hope stood at the sill, tiny hands pressed to the glass, sunlight turning her hair gold. Delilah turned back to him. Her voice was steady, filled with something stronger than all the years of silence. "Yes," she said. "Yes, it is." Thomas stood at the porch, smoothing his hand over the wood of the new frame he had carved. The sun bathed the home in a soft, golden hue, warm, steady, certain. The boards no longer creaked with memory, but settled with peace. The sharp scent of fresh sawdust still lingered in the air, mixing with the gentle aroma of bread cooling on the windowsill. Delilah stepped out, hope clinging to her skirt, her hair curled at the edges from the bath earlier, cheeks flushed pink. She held a folded cloth in one hand, a new curtain she had sewn that morning, stitched with tiny forget-me-nots at the corner. Behind them, the door stood open, just slightly, a small symbol that this home, once sealed in grief, was now open to sunlight, to laughter, to love. He did not kneel. He did not hold out a ring. Just looked at her the same way he had the night she was bleeding on a church step, like she was real and whole and worth choosing. "I'd like to give Hope a father," he said, voice low and sure. "And you a home with your name on the door." Delilah's breath hitched. Her eyes searched his face, as if still unsure this wasn't another man waiting to take something, to own something, to silence her. "No man ever asked me," she said, voice tight. "They only took. I'm asking." Delilah looked down at Hope, who blinked up with wide eyes and reached a chubby hand to Thomas. Then she looked back up and nodded. "I'd like that." The wedding was held under the cottonwood tree behind the house. Just the preacher, the blacksmith's wife, and one of the school teachers who had taken a liking to Hope. The sun filtered through the branches, dappling the ground with light. Delilah wore a dress sewn from scraps, a pale blue, the color of a sky without clouds. Hope toddled up halfway through the vows and clung to Thomas's leg, pressing her cheek against him like he had always been her safe place. Thomas said his vow simply, "I'll never raise my hand in anger. I'll never walk away from either of you." Delilah's hands trembled as she repeated her own, but when the preacher gave them leave to kiss, she didn't wait. Delilah leaned in and kissed Thomas first. It wasn't shy, it wasn't soft. It was a woman's kiss, one who had been silenced too long and finally decided to speak. Thomas's arms came around her, anchoring her in something solid and still. Hope clapped her hands. The preacher chuckled. That evening, Thomas carried a wooden sign to the front of the house and nailed it into place. The Graves home, Thomas, Delilah, and Hope. The letters were hand-carved, rough around the edges but firm. A new name, not tied to shame or loss, but to choice, to healing. A name that would live longer than memory, longer than bruises. Delilah stood back, one hand on Thomas's shoulder, the other around Hope's tiny fingers. She looked at the home, at the light pouring through the windows they had scrubbed clean, at the breeze that made the curtains dance, at the porch swing he built just for her, at the laughter that might someday echo from the walls, not in fear, but in joy. Then she said, "I was beaten for birthing a girl, but that girl led me home." And for the first time in years, she smiled, not with caution or apology, but with pride. If this story of heartbreak, resilience, and redemption moved you, don't forget to hit that hype button and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more unforgettable tales from the rugged frontier, where love grows in the dust and kindness still wins. There are more voices like Delilah's waiting to be heard, more hearts like Thomas's waiting to be seen. Stay with us, because every love story deserves to be told.